There's a weapon that could have ended World War II in 1943 instead of 1945, saving 20 million lives and rewriting the entire course of human history. It's called the B-52 Stratofortress, and if it had existed just 10 years earlier, everything we know about the modern world would be different. In 1943, the Allied bombing campaign over Germany required 1,000 B-17 bombers flying in massive formations to deliver 1,500 tons of bombs. Each mission lost 5 to 7% of aircraft to enemy fire. The raids were devastating for the crews and barely dented German industrial capacity. It took 3 years of this brutal attrition to break Nazi Germany's war machine. In 1945, the firebombing of Tokyo required 334 B-29 superfortresses carrying incendiary bombs in a single night raid. They flew at 7,000 feet, well within range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. 14 bombers were lost. 100,000 civilians died. The raid was considered a strategic success, despite the horrific cost. In 1952, the B-52 Stratofortress flew for the first time. It could carry 70,000 pounds of bombs, the payload of 23 B-17 cells. It could fly at 50,000 feet, beyond the reach of WWII-era fighters and flak. It had a range of 8,800 miles without refueling. A single B-52 could deliver more destructive power than an entire squadron of WWII bombers while being nearly invulnerable to enemy defenses. But here's what should terrify you about this alternate history. If the B-52 had existed in 1940, World War II wouldn't have been a 6-year global conflict. It would have been a 2-year annihilation campaign. The strategic bombing that defined the war would have been exponentially more destructive. And the nuclear age would have arrived with a weapon that could deliver atomic bombs with absolute impunity. This is how the B-52 would have changed World War II, but why it would have saved millions while killing millions, and why the world that emerged would be unrecognizable from our own. Before we rewrite history, you need to understand what made the B-52 so revolutionary and why it represents a quantum leap in military technology that WWII defenses couldn't counter. The B-52 wasn't just a bigger bomber, it was a different category of weapon entirely. WWII bombers were high-altitude targets that could be shot down with enough effort. The B-52 was a strategic weapon that operated beyond the reach of contemporary defenses. Here's the capability gap. A B-17 Flying Fortress carried 4,500 pounds of bombs, flew at 287 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, and had a range of 2,000 miles. It required fighter escorts, flew in defensive formations, and still lost 5 to 7% of aircraft per mission to German fighters and flak. The B-52 carried 70,000 pounds of bombs. That's 15 times the payload of a B-17. It flew at 650 miles per hour at 50,000 feet, 25,000 feet higher than WWII bombers. Its range was 8,800 miles without refueling, allowing it to strike anywhere on Earth from secure bases. But here's the revolutionary part. WWII-era defenses couldn't touch it. German BAF 109 fighters had a service ceiling of 39,000 feet, 11,000 feet below the B-52's operational altitude. Flak guns were effective to 30,000 feet. The B-52 flew 20,000 feet above that. Even the best WWII interceptors would be shooting at a target moving faster than they could climb, higher than they could reach. The B-52 would have been functionally invulnerable. German and Japanese forces would watch helplessly as American bombers flew overhead, completely beyond their ability to engage. It would be like fighting cavalry with muskets against an enemy with machine guns. And this invulnerability would have fundamentally changed the strategic calculus of the war. Let me show you exactly how history would have unfolded differently. If the B-52 had been available in 1940, the Battle of Britain would have ended before it began. Instead of sending vulnerable bombers that German fighters could intercept, Britain could have struck German industrial targets with impunity. The historical Battle of Britain lasted from July to October 1940. The Luftwaffe attacked British cities and industry while the RAF defended desperately. Germany lost 1,977 aircraft. Britain lost 1,744. Brutal and determined by the narrow margins of fighter combat. But with B-52 SACs, there would be no battle. British bombers flying at 50,000 feet could have destroyed German aircraft factories, fuel depots, and military infrastructure while German fighters watched helplessly from 40,000 feet below. The Luftwaffe couldn't defend Germany's industrial base. Within 3 months, Germany's war production would have collapsed. Aircraft factories in ruins, oil refineries destroyed, transportation networks obliterated. The Wehrmacht would be fighting with the weapons they had in stock. With no ability to replace losses, Hitler would have faced an impossible choice: continue the war with a collapsing industrial base or seek peace before Germany was bombed into submission. The invasion of the Soviet Union, planned for 1941, would have been impossible without the industrial capacity to supply it. The entire trajectory of the European war changes. No Eastern Front. No Holocaust on the industrial scale that actually occurred. No siege of Leningrad or Battle of Stalingrad. Germany would have been strategically defeated by late 1941, 2 years before the historical Allies landed in Italy. The Pacific War would have ended even more abruptly. Japan's island empire was vulnerable to bombing, and WWI bombers struggled with the vast distances. The B-52's range would have made every Japanese target accessible from the first day of war. In actual history, the Pacific bombing campaign was limited by range. B-29 Superfortresses only became available in 1944, and even then, they had to fly from captured island bases in the Marianas to reach Japan. The campaigns against Iwo Jima and Okinawa were necessary to establish air bases within B-29 range. B-52 SE could have struck Japan from Hawaii. The 800-mile distance from Pearl Harbor to Tokyo was well within the B-52's 800-mile range. No island-hopping campaigns. No bloody invasions of Tarawa, Saipan, Unjujima, or Okinawa. The strategic impact would have been immediate and devastating. Starting in December 1941, B-52 NG could have destroyed Japan's oil refineries, aircraft factories, and naval infrastructure. Japan's military ran on oil imported from the Dutch East Indies. A dozen B-52 missions could have obliterated the refining capacity. Within 6 months, Japan's navy would be immobilized. No fuel for carriers. No fuel for battleships. The entire combined fleet stuck in port. Useless. The Pacific War wouldn't require years of carrier battles and amphibious invasions. It would be a siege, with Japan's military slowly strangled by lack of fuel. But here's the most significant change. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were delivered by B-29 SEG flying at 31,000 feet, within range of Japanese defenses. The missions were dangerous, and there was genuine concern about whether the bombers would survive. B-52s could have delivered atomic weapons with absolute impunity. They would have been untouchable. The psychological impact of a weapon that could annihilate entire cities, delivered by bombers that couldn't be stopped, would have been overwhelming. Japan would have surrendered by mid-1942. No Guadalcanal, no Philippines campaign, no Okinawa. The war would have ended before most of the iconic Pacific battles ever occurred. Millions of lives saved, but through a display of aerial dominance that would have terrified the world. The most significant impact of B-52s in WWI wouldn't be military, would be the acceleration of strategic bombing theory to its most extreme conclusion. WI established that bombing civilians could break enemy morale. B-52 SEs would have proven that bombing could achieve total victory without ground armies. In actual history, strategic bombing was controversial and limited. The combined bomber offensive against Germany killed 600,000 civilians and destroyed cities, but it didn't break German morale or stop war production. Precision was impossible with WWII technology, so bombers targeted entire cities hoping to hit factories. The moral objections were significant, but overcome by necessity. Bombers were vulnerable, losses were heavy, and results were uncertain. The bombing campaigns continued because there were no better options, but the effectiveness was debatable until the very end. B-52 SEV would have eliminated the uncertainty. A single bomber could deliver the payload of an entire WWII squadron with near-perfect accuracy from 50,000 feet using advanced bomb sights. Cities could be systematically destroyed, factory by factory, with minimal risk to attacking forces. The temptation to use this power would have been overwhelming. Why send millions of soldiers to fight and die when you could bomb the enemy into submission? Why negotiate when you have the power to destroy cities at will? Here's what makes this scenario truly terrifying. The moral restraints that emerged from WWII's brutal bombing campaigns would never have developed. WI bombing was controversial because it was brutal, inaccurate, and cost thousands of bomber crews their lives. The moral weight of those losses created limits. B-52 bombing would have been clean and remote. Crews flying at 50,000 feet wouldn't see the destruction they caused. No formations of burning bombers falling from the sky, no desperate fighter battles. Just efficient destruction delivered from safe distance with minimal cost to the attacker. The psychology of unlimited aerial power would have created a different post-war world. America would have won WWII, not through costly island invasions and massive ground armies, but through strategic bombing that was functionally unstoppable. That lesson would have shaped Cold War strategy in dangerous ways. The geopolitical consequences of a B-52-enabled Allied victory would have created a vastly different post-war world. The balance of power, the formation of alliances, and the entire structure of international relations would have been unrecognizable. In actual history, WWII ended with the Soviet Union controlling Eastern Europe. The Red Army fought from Stalingrad to Berlin, suffering 27 million casualties and occupying everything in its path. The Cold War emerged because Soviet ground forces controlled half of Europe. But with B-52 SES, there would be no Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. Germany would have been defeated by strategic bombing before the Eastern Front developed. The Soviet Union would never have advanced westward because there would be no Wehrmacht for them to fight. The map of post-war Europe would be completely different. No Berlin Wall, no Eastern Bloc. Germany would have been occupied by the Western Allies alone, creating a unified democratic Europe decades earlier. But the Soviet Union would have been furious and terrified. They would have watched America win WWII using air power they couldn't match. The United States would have demonstrated the ability to destroy any nation on Earth without risking ground forces. The nuclear age would have begun with America holding an invincible delivery system. In actual history, both the US and Soviet Union had bombers that could deliver nuclear weapons, but could also be shot down. Mutual deterrence was based on both sides being vulnerable. B-52 SEF would have broken that equation. America could deliver nuclear weapons to Soviet cities with impunity, while Soviet bombers could be intercepted. The nuclear balance would have been dangerously unstable, with America holding overwhelming first strike capability. The Cold War would have been more aggressive and dangerous. The Soviet Union would have raced to develop countermeasures, surface-to-air missiles, high-altitude interceptors, anything to counter the B-52 threat. The arms race would have accelerated, with both sides feeling existentially threatened. Alternatively, the Cold War might never have emerged. America's overwhelming air superiority might have convinced Stalin that confrontation was suicidal. The Soviet Union might have been forced into accommodation, creating a post-war world with American hegemony that was even more absolute than in our timeline. Beyond the immediate war outcomes, B-52s in WW would have accelerated military technology by a decade. The jet age, guided missiles, and radar systems that actually emerged in the 1950s would have been developed in the 1940s as desperate responses to an unstoppable bombing threat. Germany and Japan would have thrown everything into developing countermeasures. In actual history, Germany developed the Me-262 jet fighter by 1944, but it came too late and in too small numbers. With B-52 SEF bombing them from 1940 onward, jet fighter development would have been the highest priority from day one. The technological pressure would have been immense. Nations facing extinction from unstoppable bombers would have invested everything in developing higher-flying interceptors, radar-guided missiles, and early warning systems. The arms race would have begun 5 years earlier. Jet engines, radar-guided missiles, and early computing would have advanced rapidly. In our timeline, these technologies developed gradually through the 1940s and 1950s. In this alternate timeline, they would have been crash-developed as survival necessities. The result would be a 1950 that looks like our 1960. Surface-to-air missiles, supersonic interceptors, and advanced radar networks would exist a decade earlier. The military-industrial complex would be larger and more entrenched. The arms race would be further advanced and more dangerous. But here's the most significant technological impact. The B-52's success would have validated strategic bombing as the decisive form of warfare. The entire post-war military structure would have been built around air power rather than balanced forces. Army and Navy budgets would have been slashed. Why maintain massive ground forces when air power can win wars? Why build huge navies when bombers can sink ships from 50,000 feet? The military hierarchy would have shifted dramatically toward the Air Force. This shift would have consequences for every conflict that followed. Korea, Vietnam, and subsequent wars would have been approached with an air power first mentality. The lessons of WW would suggest that bombing can solve any military problem. The human cost of this belief would have been enormous. Bombing campaigns in Korea and Vietnam would have been even more extensive and destructive, with military leadership convinced that enough bombing could win any war. The restraints that emerged from WWE's bombing campaigns wouldn't exist because B-52, say, in WWE would have proven that bombing works. The most unsettling aspect of this alternate history is contemplating how much more destructive W would have been with invulnerable strategic bombers. The moral barriers that restrained bombing in our timeline would never have developed. In actual history, WWI bombing killed 2 million civilians. The campaigns against Hamburg, Dresden, Tokyo, and other cities were controversial even during the war. The death tolls shocked people and created moral debates that continue today. With B-52 SAS, those numbers would have been higher. When bombing is safe, efficient, and effective, there's no pressure to limit it. The temptation to bomb more targets, more frequently with larger payloads, would have been overwhelming. German and Japanese cities would have been systematically destroyed, not gradually over 3 years, but quickly and thoroughly. Every factory, every transportation hub, every government building would have been targeted with overwhelming force. The civilian death toll could have reached 5–10 million. That's purely from conventional bombing, before considering nuclear weapons. The efficiency of B-52 submarines would have made the destruction of cities routine rather than controversial. And the world would have accepted it, because the alternative would have been worse: longer war. More casualties, more suffering. The moral calculations would have justified the bombing because it shortened the war and saved Allied lives. This is the dark lesson of invulnerable air power. When one side can destroy the other without risk, restraint disappears. The moral weight of putting bomber crews at risk, the knowledge that attacking means your people die too, creates limits. Remove that weight, and destruction becomes clinical. The post-war world would have been built on this lesson. Conflict could be resolved through strategic bombing. Enemies could be annihilated from safe distance. Military power meant air power. The entire moral framework of warfare would have been different. If the B-52 had existed during World War II, history would have been rewritten in blood and fire. The European War would have ended by 1942. Germany's industrial base destroyed by invulnerable bombers flying beyond the reach of any defense. No Eastern Front. No Holocaust at industrial scale. Hitler defeated not by ground armies, but by strategic bombing that he couldn't counter. The Pacific War would have ended even faster. Japan's oil refineries destroyed in months, their navy immobilized, their cities burned systematically from bombers operating from Hawaii. Surrender by mid-1942, before most of the iconic Pacific battles ever occurred. Millions of lives would have been saved. No Stalingrad, no Normandy invasion, no Okinawa. The brutal ground campaigns that killed tens of millions would never have happened because the war would have been decided from 50,000 feet. But millions more would have died in the bombing. Cities systematically destroyed. Industrial areas obliterated. Civilian casualties dwarfing actual history because bombing would have been safe, efficient, and unstoppable. The restraints that limited WWII bombing wouldn't exist. The post-war world would have been unrecognizable. No Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, no Cold War balance of power, no mutual vulnerability creating deterrence. Instead, American air supremacy so absolute it would have terrified the world. The nuclear age would have begun with an invulnerable delivery system, B-52 SAS carrying atomic bombs that no defense could stop. A first strike capability that would have made the Cold War more dangerous and unstable than in our timeline. And the entire philosophy of warfare would have been corrupted. The lesson of WW would have been that strategic bombing wins wars. Korea, Vietnam, and every subsequent conflict would have been approached with massive bombing campaigns, causing destruction on scales we can barely imagine. This alternate history reveals a dark truth about military technology. Invulnerable weapons don't just change tactics, they change morality. When you can destroy enemies without risk, restraint disappears. When victory comes from safe distance, the human cost becomes abstract. The B-52 arrived in our timeline at exactly the right moment. Late enough that WWII was decided by other means. Early enough to deter Soviet aggression through mutual vulnerability. The timing prevented the worst outcomes of invulnerable air power. But this thought experiment shows us what might have been. A shorter, more destructive war. Millions saved and millions killed. A post-war world dominated by aerial supremacy and a moral framework built on the efficiency of remote destruction. Maybe we're lucky the B-52 came when it did. The weapons that arrive too late are the ones that save us from ourselves.